Good afternoon. Welcome to TickTalk, 12 February 2020. I'm Stephen Rich. I'm the professor of microbiology at the University of Massachusetts and director of the Laboratory of Medical Zoology. And the topic today that I've chosen to tell you about is tick seasonal abundance and activity. We're at a time of year when ticks might not be the most important threat on people's minds. Many areas in our listening range are probably more thinking about the snow that's still covering the ground and not so much about the ticks that are about to emerge shortly. So, although we are in winter here in the Northeast, we should be aware that ticks are not too far away. And something that I've become accustomed to in recent years is the attention that the media starts to play as we roll into the annual tick season, and starting off with the adult Ixodes scapularis deer tick season that starts in mid-March through April, depending partially on the weather. On or about the time that will start, we'll see an influx of media attention coming in. I'll get calls from local newspapers, news media, asking me to prognosticate on whether it's a big tick year or a small tick year. I try to give the same message every year, which is that it's very difficult for us to say whether there's more or less ticks, partially because while the increase or decrease in ticks may be real, it's very often very localized and can be restricted to one part of a trail or even one side of a trail to the other. Tick ecologists will try to make estimates of whether it's going to be a bad tick year or a good tick year. I think that kind of prediction is rather tenuous at best. Nonetheless, you'll see things like that, and I think it's worth drawing to your attention that those predictions are probably not terribly reliable. And better to know that ticks are there and will continue to be there. We don't see them going away anytime soon. I think part and parcel of that message that comes out of the media is the fear factor, and sometimes I think that message is overstated. That even to the point where people are frightened to go outside. And so one of the reasons I think these webinars are useful and important is to educate people and give people empower them to act out of a learned position instead of a position of fear, because I've said before, we don't make our best decisions when we're fearful. Nonetheless, the story itself has all the components of your typical horror show: the fear of death, surprise, the creepy crawly things, the kind of suspense that's building, and the fear of unusual things as new diseases emerge or new pathogens and or new tick species in some cases. All of this generates that kind of fear that's associated often with horror shows. And this isn't an idea that I came up with myself. Ian Lipkin has shared these thoughts before. He's recognized how our approach to infectious disease, and in particular to emerging infectious disease in the media, often follows that of a movie script. So if you're so inclined to watch movies, I wanted to make a plug for my friend and colleague Larry Dapsis from Barnstable County. There's a lot of great resources on the web. I often plug Tick Encounter as well at University of Rhode Island, but Larry's done a great job of putting these short videos together, which, while they're compact and freely available on the web, they're loaded with information, useful, accurate information about ticks and tick-borne diseases. And it's a good way to sort of hone up on these different topics. So I just thought I'd bring it to people's attention. The other thing I wanted to just talk about before getting into today's topic, which is about the seasonality of ticks, is I wanted to report back to you some of the latest findings from Tick Report. My colleague, Dr. Guang Xu, has been working hard to, as he always is, to improve the assays that we use for detecting pathogens and identifying the risk associated with tick bites. One of the things that he's done in recent months is he's developed a PCR assay, a barcoding assay that distinguishes the species of ticks that we receive from individuals from across the country. So, without getting too much into the weeds of this, it should be said that many of the species that we encounter, of the hundreds of species of ticks, many of them are rather difficult to distinguish from other species because they're relatively rare and the features that distinguish them are not necessarily marked. So these DNA markers have been very powerful tools to go back and look at ticks that were either in too poor of a condition to do a morphological ID, and or, as I say, are too cryptic in their species ID to be able to discern them. So I want to report to you what that retro survey, going back and barcoding those ticks, what he's finding, because I think it's kind of informative, if not in some cases very interesting. So by and large, of the 70,000 plus ticks that we've looked at since 2006, 95% of them, more than 95% of them, are the three principal human-biting ticks found in the United States. These are Ixodes scapularis, or the deer tick or black-legged tick, Dermacentor variabilis, the dog tick, American dog tick, and Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick. And you see there in that figure the count of ticks that we've received from those particular species. And then I've broken it down by the various New England and northeastern states, which I think may be represent people that may be listening to this webinar today. But I wanted to draw to your attention that in addition to those common species, there are other ticks that we receive that have been associated with human biting activity. Now, granted, many of these are very rare. These are listed in this table in order of the frequency with which we receive them. But you see things in there like the woodchuck tick, 157 now to date that we've seen. Not generally regarded as a big human-biting tick because they tend to be nest parasites living in woodchuck dens, but nonetheless, there are instances of those ticks having bitten people. The one below that, the castor bean tick, that's actually the European vector of Lyme disease, and we don't propose that castor bean tick is being established here in North America in the Northeast. This is just a further indication that we are receiving ticks from people who didn't receive their tick bites initially, at least here in North America. So these are most certainly instances of people that have a travel history. Perhaps they're traveling to the United States from their home in Europe, or have made a trip to Europe and have brought back those ticks on their person. Just glancing down the set here, you see the Asian longhorn tick, which is the one that has caught a lot of attention in recent months and years. A recent arrival spread across the country now in several states. But again, not a lot of human biting activity. So these are listed as human biting ticks. And in the case of the Asian longhorn ticks, these are most likely just ticks that were seen crawling on a person or a pet in the household. So some rare ticks. And just to round it all out, there's the complete list of those, some of them, as I say, very rare, where we've only received a single tick. But you can look down the list, and some of these surely won't sound familiar, but the zebra tick, for example, is just what it sounds like. And that's a tick that was acquired by a Boston resident who had recently been traveling in sub-Saharan Africa and acquired that tick and brought it back from that trip. So we see a lot of different ticks, although 95% of the ticks are those canonical three human-biting ticks. We see incidents of other ticks, and I just think it's kind of interesting to report that it's not just the three. So on to today's main topic today, which is the seasonal distribution and risk of tick bites or ticks that I'd like to talk about. And to start and sort of contrast this, I'd like to compare it to another vector that we've been hearing a lot about here in Massachusetts anyway, and throughout the Northeast, I suppose, which is the seasonality of mosquitoes. So we know that we're told that in the fall, the cessation of the annual mosquito cycle comes with the first frost. And so what we can kind of imagine, and this is obviously differs for different species of mosquitoes, or many different species of mosquitoes, but what we generally see is an increase starting with the warming periods in the late spring and the summer through the year of increase in the population densities of mosquitoes. And then with the coming of the cold weather, a cold snap, because mosquitoes have a aquatic phase, a juvenile aquatic phase, then that is sharply terminated when the first heavy hard frost comes across. So you see this this pattern of seasonality. Not so with ticks. The pattern with ticks is more complicated, in part because they don't have dependency on an aquatic phase, and also because they make their living in very different ways, as we've known, and we'll talk about more in future tick talks. I'm going to focus my conversations today primarily on the three species, those that represent the 95% of all the human biting activity. And you can see those three species listed here and their associated pathogens, which I'm not going to talk much about the pathogens. I really just want to focus today on sort of drawing your attention to some of the seasonal activity aspects, and then some explanations for why we think that seasonal activity is what it is. I'd remind you that those ticks feed as juveniles predominantly on the white-footed mouse. And I bring this up because we should not be surprised that there's seasonality of tick activity, because there's seasonality of virtually all wild animals, and Peromyscus leucopus, the white-footed mouse, is no exception. They have a clear breeding cycle in the spring, and you'll see a big explosion of the summer populations, and then a very high attrition rate over the winter, and then the populations sort of build up again. And we know that for lots of small mammal populations, there's, in addition to those seasonal variations, there's annual cyclic patterns as well, and rise and crash of populations. So the three ticks we're going to talk about, just again to review today, are the distribution of the black-legged tick or the deer tick. I'll use the names interchangeably. This is a tick that's widespread throughout the Northeast, also found in the Southwest, at least canonically, and then there's another focus in the upper Midwest. The more recent newcomer here in the Northeast is the Lone Star tick. We see it pretty widespread, or geographically widespread, in the state of Massachusetts. It's still nowhere near as abundant, as I'll show you in a moment, as the black-legged tick, but it is here. It's a tick that started its range in the southeastern United States, largely associated with white-tailed deer, and probably is benefiting from the high density of white-tailed deer that we have here in New England, and is spreading its range accordingly. And then the last member of our triumvirate is the American dog tick, which has this widespread eastern distribution to even west of the Mississippi, and then another focus on the west coast, which may actually turn out to be a separate species or subspecies. The jury's out on that one. Nonetheless, this is another common human biting tick, more prevalent in the Northeast, here in Massachusetts, for example, than Lone Star ticks, but not as abundant as the black-legged tick. So to start the conversation about timing and seasonality, I just point out that one of the things we know is that there is a geographic component to the difference in timing, that is. And so here's a study a few years ago by Moore et al., actually from 2014, where they went back and they looked at epidemiological records and recorded the first instance, the first week, which you can read the details in the paper of how they calculated that, but the first week of Lyme disease cases for each of the years from 1992 through 2008, and then marked those for the states of Minnesota, Connecticut, and Maryland, so geographically disparate sites, and reported that the onset of the tick disease cycle in a given place in a given year differed, and sort of had this pattern of being associated with a higher cumulative growing degree days, the lower cumulative precipitation, and then something called the saturation deficit, a lower saturation deficit, which is another measure of atmospheric moisture. And then, interestingly enough, a proximity to the Atlantic coast, and it's thought partially because that is the relictual home, the place from which these diseases first started. But nonetheless, you see that there's a difference in the timing between different geographic sites. I'm not going to be able to talk about seasonality across all of the range of Ixodes scapularis. I'm going to focus, well, a little bit here in Massachusetts, but also just speak more generally to what are the mechanisms that drive this seasonality. Again, focusing on the 3 species, but really highlighting and going into some detail with the deer tick. So to just underscore the seasonality, I'll just show you some tick report data, which is, again, the ticks that are sent to us by individuals that have been bitten by those ticks, and they are asking us to test them for pathogens and identify the species. This is a summary of the ticks that we received from New England for 2019, and the colored bars show the difference between deer ticks, dog ticks, and lone star ticks, and each of the bars is a week, a Julian week in the calendar. So a few different things for you to catch on to here. One is, if you look very closely, you can see that virtually every week of the year someone is being bitten by a deer tick, and so maybe that's the first message to be consistent with what I think I've heard from other folks that give these public messages, that there really is no time in the year here in Massachusetts in which you're completely safe from tick bites. You can get a tick bite virtually any week during the year. Nonetheless, this pattern also clearly shows that the risk in the months of January and February and March are clearly lower than, for example, the middle of May or June, where you see the bars are much higher. You're much more likely to be bitten by a deer tick, a couple hundredfold greater likelihood in May, for example, than you are in February and March. The other thing I want to point out here, because we frequently just hear this anecdotally when I'm out giving talks in public or just talking among friends, around that period, September, when school's starting, basically, people will say, boy, it's been really great. The tick numbers are really low. What's going on? Well, what's going on is the seasonality of the ticks that happens every year. Deer ticks have this natural subsidence in their activity period starting in mid-August. Part of that is that the larger ticks, the larger life stages, the nymphal ticks and adult ticks, are not active during those periods, and the ones that are mostly active are larvae, which are more likely to go undetected on our bodies when they bite us. They're also less risk because they're not associated with transmission of Lyme disease, because larvae are hatched free of infection. And so really one of the safest times of the year is that period from mid-August through the end of September in terms of the risk of exposure to deer tick bites. And I'm always surprised at the number of people that don't seem to remember from year to year that's not just 1 year. It's not just something that happened this year. It's an annual thing. It's a very rigid annual pattern. And then shortly thereafter, you see this big spike in the activity of deer ticks, and some people also seem to be caught off guard by that one, or by the spring onset that's going to come here in another couple of weeks as soon as the snow is cleared and the weather's warmed up a little bit. That's very often, as I say, when the media will pick up and say, tick numbers are exploding. Well, yeah, they are, but they're doing so in a predictable way. This is a seasonal pattern that we see every year. Every year, come April, May, we see a gentle increase up into through the months of May, June, and July, a large number of ticks. So when I'm speaking here, I'm talking mostly about the green bars, which are the deer ticks. But in the background there, you can see the yellow bars corresponding to dog ticks that have been sent to us from individuals here in New England. And then really down below those little tiny bars, the red bars, are the Lone Star ticks. So there again, you get some sense of the relative risk of deer ticks, dog ticks, and Lone Star ticks. Not only are dog ticks and Lone Star ticks less frequent in their human biting activity than deer ticks, but they also, as you can see, they have just sort of that unimodal distribution. So centering in the case of the dog ticks around early mid-June, and then basically dropping off and through the summer months, and so by September you really don't see them anymore. So too for Lone Star ticks, although the pattern is less discernible because the numbers are so small. It's generally a summer threat, and by the time the fall weathers come around, we see very little incidence of the Lone Star ticks. So these next couple slides, I'm just going to break out the individual species. So there's the dog tick. It's the same data as the previous one, but you see the pattern here with unimodal distribution sometime around June reaching its peak and then subsiding thereafter. There's the Lone Star ticks, which it's easier to see when you don't have the big bars from the other species. Again, a peak sometime on or around late June, early July. And then here's the isolated representation of the deer tick activity. So deer ticks, from here on forward, I'd like to just focus on the deer ticks because, well, first of all, they're the most important vectors and transmit the majority of the pathogens that we know. And also they have a pattern that's not unimodal as we saw with the other two species. So if we take this same data, which is the human biting deer ticks from the from New England for 2019, and we break it down by the life stage of the tick. So there are 3 life stages, active life stages: the larva, the nymphs, and the adults, listed in the order of their age. You see, again, a clear pattern where there's this spring activity of adults that reaches a peak in May and then starts to subside through the summer months. Followed there shortly thereafter, starting in May, going through June into July, a nymphal activity period. And then, as we underscored before, a cessation of virtually all activity in the late August, early September period, and then a second peak of adults. So this is the seasonal pattern, the predictable seasonal pattern, and that the shape of these curves will vary a little bit. The height of the curves will vary a little bit. It will vary locally to a certain extent, but by and large, we'll see this pattern repeated state by state, county by county, town by town, with variations between sites within a town. But generally, this pattern is pretty rock solid, and so we can predict when the risk is going to be the highest. And it's thought that one of the biggest periods of risk is associated with those gold bars in this figure, because those are the nymphal ticks, which are infected at a lower rate than adult ticks. Adult ticks are infected at about a rate of about 50%. Nymphal ticks maybe 30% or mid-20s. But because they're so much smaller, they have a higher likelihood of feeding longer and transmitting their pathogens, as we've spoken before about the increasing risk associated with feeding time. We'll visit that again next time when we talk about feeding behaviors. So let's drill in a little bit and figure out why this peculiar seasonal pattern, because what I'm hoping is, first of all, that the message that there is this bimodal distribution will become a little sticky and people will become accustomed to the notion that it happens. And maybe one of the ways to making that stick in people's minds is to explain why it exists or what the biological underpinnings are. And it's a question that I get pretty frequently. Why do ticks have these patterns? Why are they inactive in these months in September, for example, when it seems like it would be ideal for a tick? So to start that conversation, I just remind you that ticks have, deer ticks in the Northeast have a 2-year life cycle that follows here. Starting with around 10 o'clock, you see that large tick body with a bunch of eggs at the front of the tick. That's a female tick that's laid her eggs. And then if you move to the center of the circle, you can see the egg batch there, and that will start the cycle at the egg hatch. That female will lay 2,000 to 3,000 eggs. Those eggs will hatch and become larval ticks. Larval ticks are very, very tiny, 6-legged organisms that seek out a host, very often a small white-footed mouse. And it's important also to remember that those larvae are hatched free of infection with Lyme disease. They don't have Lyme disease in them at that point. They acquire infection when they feed on the spirochete carrier, shown here as a white-footed mouse. They'll take a single blood meal as a larva, feed to repletion, fall off that host, and then use all of the energy they accumulated from that blood meal to then molt to the next life stage, which is the nymphal stage. At this point, if they fed on an infected mouse, they now become an infected nymph and now can go on to infect other hosts. If they happen to feed on a mouse that was not infected, which is likely early on in the season before the infections ramp up, then that nymphal tick will be uninfected, and so too it will go on to feed on a mouse but not transmit infection. So you see that representing going around the wheel here, going up to about 11 o'clock where the nymphs become active and feed on larger hosts. This is when we start to see more human biting activity and larger hosts. And so very often we get bit by nymphs. Mice are also feeding nymphs at a high rate. Our companion animals, and then to a certain extent deer as well, become hosts at this point. And again, if you're unfortunate enough to be fed upon by one of those 30% of the ticks that are infected, then you would be exposed to that pathogen that they acquired in that larval blood meal. If they don't feed on us, if the nymphal ticks feed on a naturally occurring host, because if they feed on us, they end up falling off in our houses, and it's not a particularly good place for them to live. So if they feed on a natural host, a mouse particularly, they'll end up back in the leaf litter, back in the state where they're going to utilize that full blood meal, single blood meal they took as a nymph, to molt to the next stage, which is then the adult. And at that point, for the first time in their life, although their sex is determined genetically by their chromosomal differences, this is the first time that they differentiate morphologically into males and females. And at that point, they also differ behaviorally because the males at that point will do nothing other than seek females. They might take a small blood meal, but they're not going to feed to repletion as they had in the earlier stages. The females, they will feed to repletion, but this time they're not going to use all that nutrition to molt to a next phase, because this is basically the end of their life. What they'll do is they'll use all of that nutrition to manufacture the 2,000 eggs that they're going to lay if we complete the cycle over there at 10 o'clock, and lay their 2,000 to 3,000 eggs utilizing the resources that they got from that blood meal. So there it is, a 2-year life cycle. And the reason it's really great to show it as a wheel like this is you can see there are overlapping generations in this life cycle, that there are points at which the larval ticks are, I'll put it the other way, the nymphal ticks actually precede chronologically in a given year the active cycle of the larval ticks. So the infected nymphal ticks are giving infection to the mice that are in turn giving infection to the uninfected larval ticks. It's a little hard to follow perhaps, but maybe graphically if you see it there, that's really what makes the wheels go round in terms of the Lyme disease cycle. And it's that fact that nymphal ticks are feeding before the larval ticks that makes the Lyme disease cycle possible. So this is another representation. So this is the same 2-year life cycle, but I've shown the overlapping generations from one year to another, so that you can see on a given year, you can have a position where you have nymphs and larvae corresponding active at about the same time, but the nymphs actually preceding the larval advance. And a couple of things to point out here is the timing of when these activities actually take place. So again, the larvae are active in the late summer through the earliest days of fall. The nymphs are then active the following year because they're going to spend a whole winter off the host and then become nymphs and emerge in the next late spring, early summer, take another blood meal, and then that fall emerge as adults, or in some instances, as shown by those little straight skinny lines, will overwinter as adults and then continue their activity in the fall. So a little bit of a confusing life cycle, but there you see the seasonality, and in that seasonality, and I'll show another view of this in a moment, you see gaps in the seasonality. You see periods, as for example that log line represented by the winter months, when ticks aren't active. And that's because there are environments that ticks consider quite extreme. So there are basically two environmental conditions that ticks try to avoid. One is extreme cold, and the other is extreme dry conditions. So one way to think about this, and if there are turf people in the audience, they may not like this interpretation, but I think one approximate way to think about this is depending on what's going on your lawn or going on with your lawn. If your lawn is covered with snow, it's probably not a happy time for ticks. I'm not saying just on your lawn, but elsewhere, wherever they are in the edge or the forested habitat nearby. If your lawn is covered with snow, the ticks in the forest are probably hunkering down. So too, if your lawn is scorched at the end of the summer and the condition is very, very dry, so too is that a very unfavorable set of circumstances for ticks. And so again, I'll just use the word hunker down for a moment, but they're not active, we'll say. They're biding their time and waiting for times to get better. And it's that changing of their season now, changing of waiting for better conditions that manifests as this pattern of seasonality. So I just want to point out that ticks do have physiological and anatomical mechanisms that help them to cope with some of these things. So it's not that they're totally unarmed when it comes to combating the cold, for example. You may be familiar with the idea that ticks, like many, many organisms, produce a kind of antifreeze, a glycoprotein that serves to prevent cells from freezing under. It basically raises the freezing point of the body so that the cells aren't ruptured by the freezing process. And in this figure, I'm just showing that in some cases it seems like infection, for example, with anaplasma, can induce the genes that manufacture that code that glycoprotein, which also has a bactericidal activity. So it actually prevents infection with other bacteria, which I won't get into that story for the moment at this moment. But I'll tell you that they do produce antifreezes, and the antifreeze is a resistance mechanism that avoids their hypothermic death. They also have a peculiar characteristic of their salivary glands. So ticks, using the mouth parts, as you can see there on the top end of those two ticks, the mouth parts don't drink water, for example, from ponds or standing water, but what they can do is through acini, these small nodules on the salivary glands, they can produce these hygroscopic molecules which attract atmospheric moisture to the end of the mouth parts, and then they can slurp up the they can slurp up the water in that fashion, so that under conditions of dehydration, where they're up questing at the top of the leaflet, at the top of a branch, they can crawl back into the leaf litter, and they can use this trick to draw moisture out of the air to avoid desiccation, which is one of the big ways that ticks succumb by natural causes. So those are mechanisms, adaptations that ticks can use to overcome those extreme conditions. They also do what incorporate the strategies that every other species incorporate. So there's basically two things that animals do when conditions are unfavorable. One is they migrate, right? They move away from the condition. Well, that's not really an option for ticks because they don't have the ability to fly, obviously. They don't have a great locomotion capacity. They can't walk great distances. And so migration isn't really an option for them. The biggest movements they do would be phoretic transfer on the back of hosts, but it's not a reliable means to be removed from those unfavorable conditions. And then the other thing that they can do, the animals in general, is if they can't migrate, they can hibernate, which is the vernacular term for what I'm going to call dormancy in a moment here. But the idea here is if you come to a place where the conditions are unfavorable, then you can arrest your development and or cease activity until things become better. And that's exactly what ticks do. They utilize dormancy, a couple different types of dormancy, where they basically shut down so that they are not exposing themselves to those extreme conditions, either the cold or the dry conditions. And they do this in a couple of different ways. One of them I'll call quiescence, which could also be called torpidity. And that's an immediate response, and it's a response to existing conditions that are unfavorable. For example, low humidity. So if all of a sudden there's just a particularly dry wind or a dry day, ticks can utilize quiescence to crawl back down into a spot where conditions are more favorable. Very often leaf litter. You'll see that leaf litter is a very protective environment for them. And then they can just wait it out. They can wait until those conditions change. And then once the conditions are overcome, once the dryness or the coldness has gone away, for example, if it's a cold snap in a late spring day, then they can very quickly resolve and return to the activity without a lot of investment of energy. Quiescence is different from diapause. Diapause is more closely to what we think of when we think of hibernating animals. Diapause is, first of all, it's hormonally controlled, so it's a bigger physiological change, and it leads to a developmental arrest and comes in anticipation of an environmental change or an environmental condition that's going to be unfavorable. So unlike quiescence, diapause is something that's usually induced by a mechanism that's more likely to be predictive of what's going to happen in coming months. So while quiescence can respond to very sudden changes that lead to unfavorable conditions, diapause is more hardwired and is a recognition on the part of the system that conditions are going to be unfavorable in a predictable way and over a longer period of time. Diapause, unlike quiescence, also requires a fixed period of latency to return to the developmentally active stage. So in order to come out of diapause, it takes a length of time. So you can't just snap your fingers as you can in quiescence and move from that condition of dormancy into the activity cycle. It requires an investment of energy and an investment of time to come out of diapause. So there's just a picture of the leaf litter, emphasizing that leaf litter makes a very effective environment for ticks to crawl underneath to find more favorable humidity conditions when conditions are dry. And so just the very simple model of quiescing, moving out of a questing situation and moving back down into the leaf litter, they can wait out short-term changes that lead to unfavorable conditions. And in some cases, leaf litter combined with snowfall actually creates an even better insulation for them. So there was a study, which I'm going to show you in a moment, that looked at the role that leaf litter and snow plays in terms of insulating ticks from those harsher conditions. This was a study done in the years 2015 to 2018. What they did was they took these plots. They had pots that they put in the ground. The ticks were put inside the pots, and then they had different treatments and different controls. Some sites where they just left it alone and just let the leaf litter be what it was and let the snow fall on top of the pots. In other cases, they cleared the snow. Some cases they cleared the leaf litter. In some cases they cleared both. And then they monitored how the temperatures for those local sites were, and they looked at survivorship of the ticks that were put in those pots. And so you see here, this is over the course of the months of December and January, and this was incidentally done at 2 sites, one in Maine and one in Connecticut. So one a slightly colder site, one a slightly warmer site. And what's interesting here is all you really have to look at is this blue line at the bottom. That shows the ambient temperature. So that's the air temperature that you might see in the weather report. And all those lines above, those are the lines of the pots or of the soil. It was either underneath the snow, underneath the leaves, or underneath both. And so you see the leaf litter and the snow has a very insulating characteristic. It insulates the ticks or the ground underneath from those more extreme temperature burdens. Still, the temperature does drop at the soil level, but not the extremes that you see in the ambient temperature. So I'm just going to thumb through a couple of these so that you can see. This is 2015 to 2016, 2016, 2017. So you can see the pattern of temperatures here. It was different in 2016 and 17. But again, the ambient temperature, even when it drops very low, for those sites that had leaf litter and or snow, the temperatures remain more moderate over time. Still, perhaps below freezing, as you can see, it still very often goes below freezing. But again, they've got these mechanisms to tolerate sub-freezing temperatures. What they're really trying to do is avoid those -20 spikes and those -10 spikes. And by going under the leaf litter, they're effectively doing that. And here's just the last year showing that. So again, just another pattern. So clearly variation year to year, but some consistent results that show that by removing leaf litter, you can actually lower the protective value a little bit. By removing the snow, you also remove that protective value. You remove both, and you're removing a substantial amount of protection, but even still, you're on the ground, you're not seeing the same temperature that you're seeing in the ambient conditions. So there's safety for the ticks by being lower in the ground in these pots. And this is just to tell you, so those were temperature changes. This is the same study, and just showing the results over over that 3-year period. You can see, for example, in the first column, in the control population, 94% of the ticks, so where they left everything alone, they left the leaf litter in place, they left the snow in place, 94% of the ticks, I think there were 270 ticks, I think, in each pot, 94% of them survived. Whereas in Maine, you had a lower survival rate, even in the control site, reflecting probably the more extreme temperatures. But when you look down the columns there, first it's snow removal, leaf removal, and then removal of both, you can see how the survivorship decreases when you take away those protective layers. So this is just to demonstrate that there's a great deal of protective value to the ticks just by having leaf litter, just by having the snow to protect them. So a couple different interpretations here to bear in mind, and this is not absolutely a hardwired conclusion, but when someone says that high snowfall is going to lead one way to another to the density of ticks, well, you can see here that snow removal certainly plays a role on survivorship of ticks, but it's not the only role. And so snowfall probably isn't the principal determinant, especially in climates where the snow is not so deep, and that it may be actually leaf litter, which is more difficult for us to control, is a big determinant in terms of survivorship. And so this is one reason that you'll hear people say that manicuring lawns, keeping the leaves raked and wood piles pushed back, is a good way to keep ticks away, because you're not providing that safe haven for the ticks. So that might be how you treat your lawn. If you have a wooded area in your house, obviously you're not going to be able to remove those factors. So let's dig a little bit more down. So there's the survivorship, and again, showing that clear pattern of seasonality. Let's figure out what it is about the seasonal pattern that might be learned from just the life cycle itself. So there's some very interesting work that's been done. We do some of this stuff in our lab, where you can rear ticks in the laboratory for experimental purposes. And so you can take what is otherwise a 2 or even 3 year life cycle in nature, and you can accelerate it to a few months by pushing the developmental cycle to its fastest terms. And you can take a 2 year life cycle and reduce it down to 5 or 7 months. But you can't get it lower than that, because all of these different factors shown here that go from hatching an egg, or laying an egg and hatching an egg, to developing as a larva, to feeding as a larva, to digesting the blood meal, etc. All of those things have a certain minimum time. Larval hatching can't be accelerated above 35 days. Even under ideal conditions of humidity and temperature, it's going to take 35 days for larvae to hatch. So the whole process takes 5 to 7 months. So if you imagine to go from adult laying an egg back to another adult in the next generation, taking somewhere from 5 to 7 months, well, in the Northeast, you really don't have a stretch of 5 to 6 months of weather when it doesn't get cold or it doesn't get particularly dry. So what we're seeing in the seasonality of ticks is basically working around those really those less than ideal conditions and spreading out the different components of that developmental life cycle to accommodate the tick under the more favorable set of circumstances. And the result of that, you really have to stretch the life cycle, that 5 to 7 month minimum, so that 5 to 7 month timing, incidentally, doesn't involve any time that it might take to actually find a host. Ticks spend a considerable amount of their life just looking for hosts. In the laboratory, they don't have to look because we put them on a host and we've solved that problem for them. But in the wild, they have to account for that time as well. And so the timing, what happens in the laboratory in 5 months, really takes 2 years, and it gets staggered in a way that the ticks aren't having to deal with those most unfavorable set of circumstances. Okay, so the seasonal activity patterns, what explains them? Well, basically, there's a couple of things going on. One is there's the tactical response to ambient conditions. So that's the short-term response to temperature, the amount of sunshine. I'm not talking about day length there, but actually whether it's cloudy or sunny. Rainfall and relative humidity. All of these things can induce tactical responses. Ticks can make a choice to move to a different environment to seek a better set of circumstances. If it's too sunny out, then they can seek shade. If it's too rainy, they can go under the leaves. If it's too dry, again, they can find parts in the leaf, under the leaf litter where it's moister. As opposed to the more strategic long-term changes that they can do, which anticipate seasonal changes. So whereas tactical responses can be directly proportional to something like temperature, and for a long time it was thought that diapause was done in response to temperature, it's now pretty evident that diapause is induced more by changes in the photoperiod or the length of days. That length of day is a much better predictor of when the seasons are changing than the weather, as we know. Because we can have some really cold days in June or some really warm days in January, and we wouldn't want to rely our survivorship, I'm thinking as a tick for a moment, we wouldn't want our survivorship to rely on making a prediction based on those aberrant days that arise. Whereas length of day is really a more hardwired thing that's predictor of what's to come. And so those strategic anticipation of seasonal changes are probably linked to those kinds of events and lead to things like diapause. And then the different types of diapause that we can have. We can think about developmental diapause, where you can actually delay the onset of development through the existing life stage. So this would be a nymphal tick that's going to wait before it develops and ecdysis to the next stage, or it can be a behavioral diapause where they actually just, I used the word early on in this talk about saying they could hunker down. They could basically sit down and avoid those circumstances for a length of time or reduce their activity. So there's some nice theoretical work that's been done on this by Gray and colleagues, and I'm just going to go through it quickly. A bit of this is probably more detailed than we want to get into too much at this point, but what they've done here is they've sort of put out the hypothetical 3-year life cycle of an exodid tick. And when I say exodid, I mean Ixodes scapularis, the deer tick that we have here in the Northeast. But it turns out that the same kind of pattern happens for Ixodes ricinus, the castor bean tick in Europe, Ixodes persiccatus in Asia, and Ixodes pacificus. And it works kind of like this, that larvae have an activity period, or a bimodal activity period, theoretically, that's shown here by the curves A and B. And some point in the middle, shown by that dotted line, you can imagine there's a point when the photoperiod such that the day length becomes such that the ticks make a decision that they're not going to eat that year, and they're going to enter either a diapause, and they're either going to eat and then enter a behavioral diapause over the winter while they digest, or they're going to make a decision to enter a developmental diapause because they haven't ate yet, and they're going to wait to develop and then emerge in the following spring. That's what leads to this this pattern, this separation of the different life stages, is when you have the ticks sort of, and I'm saying it anthropomorphically as if they're making a decision. There's strong selection pressures that if the ticks make the right choice, or if they make have the right behavior, then they are more likely to survive, and that kind of behavior will become more hardwired. The same kind of thing can happen with nymphs, that you can see ticks making the decision or coming to a point where they're going to either feed before that cutoff point or feed after it. And there's a third peak here, which is the C peak, showing in the nymphal stages, you can actually have nymphs emerging in a year that correspond to the larvae from earlier in that year. So in this case, the C peak would be ticks that are again going to diapause and probably overwinter in the state of being unfed. And adults look the same way. And when you put those three curves together in a single pattern, then you start to see this concurrent pattern where you have the situation with adults and nymphs and larvae sort of existing at the same time, but in fact they're out of sync and they're from different generations. So the adults that you see in the given year are the larvae from 3 years ago. And so that kind of pattern, again, this is not a pattern of any particular species, but it explains the kind of plasticity that can go on in these life cycles and lead to the situation that we have, for example, in Ixodes scapularis in the deer tick, where you have a larval tick that precedes the nymphal tick, and that's very favorable for pathogen transmission. So diapause is one of the reasons that we see this seasonality, and it's evident in all those different tick species that I talked about. These are the world's major vectors of Lyme disease: Ixodes pacificus on the west coast of North America, persiccatus in Asia, Ixodes ricinus in Europe, and Ixodes scapularis here in North America. And there are different types of developmental and behavioral diapause that they exercise, different types of adaptations, different life stages, and together they sort of piece this together to make an optimal lifestyle that fits the climate they're living in. So just to summarize, deer ticks have distinct periods of high and low activity across the calendar year. It behooves all of us to be familiar with those distinct periods so that we know when to anticipate ticks coming out and not be confused with a sudden onslaught of ticks as being the next tick apocalypse. The second point is that ticks use various strategies to avoid unfavorable conditions, including diapause and various types of quiescence, and that they do this to great effect. And so when we're thinking about ways to interrupt the tick transmission cycle, we can take that into account and figure out ways that minimize their opportunities for doing those kinds of behaviors. And then lastly, just for information, I pointed out that ticks have physiological and anatomical adaptations that permit survival in cold and dry habitats. And I told you about the glycoprotein, the antifreeze glycoprotein made by the IAFGP protein, gene, and then the hygroscopic acini that are found in the salivary glands and help the animal to harvest moisture from the environment. So I'm going to conclude the talk for today and end here on this slide, which is just to announce the next tick webinar, which will be given on March 11th. Again, it's at 12 o'clock, so these are the second Wednesdays of the month. I'll be talking about tick behavior, finding hosts, and feeding. I might have a guest come in and talk about this with us. As always, we're open to receiving your questions. Please contact us if you have any questions. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month.